The wind howled across the vast prairie, its icy fingers threading to the tall grass as the last light of day bled into the horizon. The wagon stood like a lonely sentinel against the coming night, its wooden frame creaking in protest as a storm brewed in the distance. Eleanor Whitmore pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching the sky darken. The road west had been long and grueling, each mile stretching into the next with an unrelenting sameness. But tonight, something felt different. Thomas, her husband, worked in silence beside the small fire, his hands deftly securing the harnesses of their weary horses. He was a man of quiet resolve, broad-shouldered and sun-scarred, a testament to years of toil. Their son, Samuel, just 6 years old, sat cross-legged on a folded blanket, humming to himself as he turned over a small wooden horse in his hands. The boy's presence was the only warmth in the encroaching cold, his innocence untouched by the silent dread curling in Eleanor's chest. "We'll reach the next settlement by midday tomorrow," Thomas murmured without looking up. "Should be safer there." Safer. It was a word that had lost its meaning out here. There were no guarantees on the frontier, only the illusion of security, and even that was as fickle as the wind. They had heard the stories, wagons disappearing, travelers swallowed by the night with no trace left behind. The land did not forgive mistakes. Eleanor glanced toward the distant tree line, where skeletal branches reached skyward like supplicant hands. Shadows pooled beneath them, deep and impenetrable. Something moved there, just at the edge of sight, but when she blinked, the darkness swallowed her whole. She exhaled, shaking off the unease. It was just the wind, just the night playing tricks on her. "Come to bed," she said softly, brushing a hand against Thomas's shoulder. He nodded, though his gaze lingered on the prairie beyond. After a moment, he tossed another log onto the fire, sending a spray of embers into the cold air. The crackling flames cast flickering shapes against the wagon's canvas as they climbed inside, tucking Samuel between them. Eleanor closed her eyes. Sleep did not come easily, not out here, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her limbs. The distant rumble of thunder filled the silence, the storm creeping closer. A sound woke her. At first, she thought it was the wind, a low murmur threading through the fabric of the wagon. But as her consciousness sharpened, she realized it was something else, something too deliberate, too human, a whisper, barely audible, just outside the canvas. Her breath hitched. She turned her head slowly, straining to listen. Nothing, just the fire crackling outside, the occasional shuffle of the horses. But the feeling remained, an unbearable awareness that someone or something was near. Carefully, she shifted, slipping free of the blanket without disturbing Thomas or Samuel. The air inside the wagon was thick with warmth, but as she pushed the canvas flap aside, a cold gust stole her breath. The fire had burned low, casting only faint illumination over the campsite. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of darkness. The horses stood still, their ears flicking as if listening to something beyond her perception. Then she saw it, a figure at the tree line, a shape barely distinguishable from the shadows, standing motionless among the skeletal branches. It was impossible to tell if it was man or apparition, but every fiber of Eleanor's being screamed that she was not meant to see it. A chill crept down her spine. She should wake Thomas. She should call out. But something about the figure held her tongue, an unspoken warning settling deep in her gut. Then it moved. A step forward, slow and deliberate. Another. The movement was almost unnatural, as if the night itself had taken shape and was closing the distance between them. Her breath came shallow. The firelight barely reached beyond the wagon, but as the figure advanced, something glinted in its grasp, a blade reflecting the dying embers. Eleanor turned sharply, scrambling back inside the wagon. She reached for Thomas, fingers pressing against his arm, just as something strong and unyielding wrapped around her wrist. A cry strangled in her throat as she was yanked backward, her feet slipping on the cold earth. The grip was impossibly strong, fingers digging into her skin like iron shackles. She struggled, twisting, kicking, but the force dragging her away was relentless. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the canvas flap falling back into place, hiding her family from view. Then the night took her. Pain was the first thing she knew. A dull, throbbing ache at the base of her skull, spreading like ink through her senses. Her body felt leaden, her limbs slow to respond. A damp, earthen scent filled her nose, mingled with the acrid tang of smoke. Somewhere close, water dripped in slow, rhythmic intervals, each drop echoing to the murky haze of her mind. Eleanor forced her eyes open. Darkness greeted her, thick and suffocating, the only light flickering from a distant fire. The glow licked against rough-hewn wooden walls, casting jagged shadows that danced like specters. She was inside a cabin, its interior crude and unwelcoming. The air was heavy with unwashed bodies, with sweat leather, and something more metallic, something she refused to name. Her hands were bound. The realization sent a bolt of fear through her, sharpening her senses like a blade. Coarse rope bit into the skin of her wrists, pulled tight against the post she was lashed to. Her legs were free, but weakness sat deep in her bones. Her head lolled forward, and she exhaled, slow and measured, fighting the nausea roiling in her gut. Voices rumbled nearby, low and indistinct. Through half-lidded eyes, she glimpsed figures gathered around the fire. A handful of men, their faces lined with hardship and malice. One of them sat apart from the others, his chair tilted back against the wall. He was older than the rest, lean but not frail, his long coat dusted with the filth of the road. A thick beard obscured most of his face, save for eyes that gleamed sharp and assessing. Jedediah Kane. She had never seen him before, but she knew his kind. He was the sort of man stories whispered about, ruthless, cunning, a predator in the skin of a man. He sat in silence, listening as the other spoke, his fingers idly tapping against the handle of the knife resting on his thigh. "She ain't worth nothing dead," one of the men muttered, shifting uncomfortably under Kane's gaze. "She ain't worth nothing alive, neither," another said. Eleanor swallowed against the fear tightening her throat. They were deciding what to do with her. Whether she lived or died hinged on nothing more than their whims, on whether Kane found her existence useful. She forced herself to steady her breathing, forced herself to listen. If she panicked, she was as good as dead. One of them, the broadest among them, with a face like weathered stone, leaned closer to the fire. "Maybe we send word. Ransom her back to whatever husband's looking for her." A dry chuckle. "You think a man's going to pay for a woman lost on the trail? If she was worth something, she would not have been wandered alone." Kane didn't speak. His gaze flicked toward her, measuring, weighing. Eleanor held his stare, refusing to shrink beneath it. A slow smile curled at the edge of his mouth, though it didn't touch his eyes. "She's got fight in her," he murmured. "Might be more trouble than she's worth." Eleanor clenched her jaw. If he decided she was a liability, he'd slit her throat before sunrise. She had to give him a reason to keep her breathing. She wet her lips, voice hoarse. "My husband will come." The men stilled. Kane tilted his head, amused. "That's so." "He's a tracker," she lied. "He'll follow your trail, and when he does, he won't come alone." A few of them shifted uneasily. Frontier justice was swift and merciless. No one wanted to be on the receiving end of a posse's noose. But Kane only chuckled, the sound slow and deliberate. "You got spirit, I'll give you that." He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "But I've been on these plains a long time, and I know what happens when a woman disappears out here." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Kane stood, stretching lazily before turning to the others. "We ride at first light. Pack up." The men grumbled but obeyed, gathering supplies and dousing the fire. Kane spared her one last glance before stepping outside, leaving her in the dim glow of dying embers. Her time was running out. She twisted her wrists, ignoring the sting as the rope chafed raw against her skin. The knots were tight, but if she worked them enough, if she kept at it, a voice murmured from the darkness. "You shouldn't have said that." She froze. The man leaning against the far wall was younger than the others, his features obscured by shadow. His voice held no malice, only quiet resignation. Eleanor swallowed. "Why?" He shifted, the faint firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. "Because now they'll make sure no one finds you." The words sat heavy between them. Eleanor forced her breathing steady. She would not let fear consume her. She would not let them decide how this ended. She worked the knots in silence. The hours dragged, the fire burning lower until the cabin was swallowed in near darkness. The men outside spoke in hushed tones, their voices carried away by the restless wind. Then an opportunity. One of the men re-entered, grumbling as he rifled through a saddlebag near the door. He paid her no mind, his back turned. Eleanor moved without thinking. Her bindings gave just enough slack. She pulled free, fingers trembling, and reached the discarded knife on the ground nearby. The man turned. Their eyes met. Eleanor drove the blade into his thigh. Before he could cry out, he collapsed with a strangled curse, his body hitting the ground in a tangle of limbs. Shouts erupted outside. Heart hammering, she sprinted for the door, her legs sluggish from hours of immobility. She stumbled into the night, cold air shocking her lungs. A gunshot split the air. Dirt exploded near her feet as she ran, her vision blurred by panic and moonlight. The world was a blur of motion, grass whipping at her legs, the sting of branches slashing at her skin. The trees. If she could reach the trees, she could... Pain. A metal snap, sharp and merciless. She collapsed with a strangled cry, her leg trapped in an iron snare. Agony lanced through her, raw and consuming. Footsteps pounded behind her. Voices, curses, the scrape of boots against dirt. She clawed at the trap, fingers slipping on the cold metal. The world spun. Then another sound. A whistle, low and sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. The footsteps behind her faltered. A shadow moved beyond the trees, barely more than a shape against the moonlight. The last thing Eleanor saw before darkness swallowed her was a pair of eyes watching from the wild. Pain tethered Eleanor to consciousness. It was a deep, pulsing ache, radiating from her trapped leg and sinking its claws into her very bones. Somewhere beyond the haze, the world stirred. The whisper of wind through grass, the distant crackle of a dying fire, the rhythmic footfalls of something moving nearby. The voices of her pursuers had faded, swallowed by the night, but she was not alone. She tried to lift her head, her vision swimming. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, half shrouded in darkness, unmoving but wholly present. A ghost or a man? She couldn't tell. The moonlight carved sharp edges against his silhouette, the curve of a bough slung across his back, the quiet confidence in the way he stood. He had been watching her. Her breath hitched as he stepped forward. Closer now, she could see him clearly. His face was marked by war and wilderness. Cheekbones like cut stone, dark eyes that held no softness, only a quiet, unreadable intensity. Long braids framed his weathered face, and his clothing, made of tan hide and woven cloth, blended seamlessly into the land around him. He crouched beside her, gaze flicking to the iron trap that held her leg. Eleanor's heart pounded. She tried to pull away, but the movement sent agony ripping through her limb. A sharp gasp escaped her lips, and the man stilled, his expression unreadable. For a moment, they only stared at each other, one wounded, the other deciding. Then, without a word, he reached for the trap. His fingers worked swiftly, prying open the rusted jaws with practiced ease. The pressure on her leg released, leaving behind only the deep, biting pain of torn skin. She swallowed against the nausea rising in her throat. He stood, offering no explanation, no reassurance. Instead, he gestured, "Come." Eleanor hesitated. Behind her, the distant shouts of Kane's men cut through the night like a blade. They were still searching. If she stayed, they would find her. Her gaze flicked back to the stranger. He was already moving, silent as a shadow, slipping between the trees without waiting for her to follow. She clenched her jaw. Then she forced herself to stand. Pain lanced through her with every step, but she bit down on it, refusing to let it slow her. The stranger never looked back, but he never strayed too far ahead, as if testing her resolve. The deeper they moved into the wilderness, the quieter the world became. The prairie gave way to dense thickets, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Eleanor forced herself to match his pace, relying on sheer will to keep from collapsing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stopped. A small, concealed hollow nestled between towering rocks lay ahead, its entrance barely visible through the thick brush. He ducked inside without hesitation. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before following. The space was modest, a temporary shelter rather than a home. A fire smoldered low in a pit of stones. The scent of charred wood lingering in the cool air. Dried herbs and strips of smoked meat hung from the overhanging rock, swaying gently with the night breeze. She sank down against the rough wall, exhaustion pressing down on her like a weight. The stranger crouched near the fire, retrieving a small clay vessel. Without ceremony, he dipped his fingers into a dark salve and reached for her injured leg. Eleanor flinched, instinct tightening her muscles. He paused, gaze meeting hers, steady, patient. Not unkind, but not yielding either. She exhaled. Then, slowly, she nodded. His touch was firm but careful, smearing the cool mixture over the angry red marks left by the trap. The relief was immediate, numbing the worst of the pain. She watched him work, noting precision in his movements, the way he handled each action with quiet efficiency. "You saved me," she murmured, her voice hoarse. He didn't respond. Minutes passed in silence before he finally sat back, wiping his hands clean against a strip of cloth. His dark eyes studied her, assessing. Then at last he spoke. "Chayton." The name settled between them like an offering. Eleanor hesitated before answering. "Eleanor." He nodded once, then turned his attention back to the fire, seemingly content with the exchange. She watched him, her mind racing with unspoken questions. Who was he? Why had he helped her? Was he a wanderer, a scout, or something more? There was an edge to him, something honed and sharpened by survival. He wasn't lost out here. He belonged to this land in a way she never could. A gust of wind stirred the embers. The faint echoes of distant voices sent a chill down her spine. "They'll keep searching," she whispered. Chayton's gaze flicked toward the mouth of the hollow, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke again. "Let them." There was no fear in his voice, no doubt, only certainty, carved from a lifetime of knowing this land, knowing its dangers and its secrets. Eleanor stared at him, exhaustion weighing heavy on her limbs, but something else flickered beneath the fatigue. Hope. For the first time since she had been taken, she was not entirely alone. The night was still, but Eleanor knew it was a kind of stillness that preceded violence. She could feel it in the air, thick and waiting, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Chayton crouched near the entrance of the hollow, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. He had said little since dawn, but he didn't need to. The silence between them carried more weight than words. He had led her through the wilderness with quiet efficiency, guiding her away from Cain's men, deeper into the land's embrace. But now, there was nowhere left to run. They were coming. Eleanor tightened her grip on the knife Chayton had given her. It was smaller than the one she had stolen back at the cabin, but its edge was sharp, honed to a lethal point. It would do. A faint rustle carried through the trees, followed by the distant snort of a horse. The fire inside her burned away the last remnants of fear. She had been taken, bound, hunted. She had nearly died. But not tonight. Chayton glanced at her, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded. Then the first shot rang out. A burst of light from the trees, muzzle flash, followed by the sharp crack of gunpowder splitting the air. The bullet tore through the brush, missing its mark but announcing the battle had begun. Chayton moved first. Like a specter, he melted into the shadows, vanishing among the trees before the echoes had even faded. Eleanor pressed herself against the rock, heart hammering. Another shot. Footsteps. The men were closing in. A figure emerged in the darkness, a silhouette against the moonlight, rifle raised. Eleanor struck. She moved without hesitation, lunging forward and driving the knife deep into his side. A sharp gasp, a stagger. Then he collapsed, his weapon clattering against the earth. Blood seeped into the dirt beneath him. She barely had time to breathe before another came. Rough hands grabbed her from behind, dragging her backward. She twisted, slamming her elbow into her attacker's ribs. He cursed, grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She turned, knife raised, ready to fight. Then an arrow buried itself in his throat. The man gurgled, staggering before crumpling to the ground. Chayton stepped from the shadows, bow still raised. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something fierce in his eyes, something unrelenting. He did not kill for sport. He killed because the land demanded it. Another shot whizzed past them. Kane's men were relentless. Eleanor dropped low, grabbing the fallen rifle from the man she had stabbed. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to steady. She had seen Thomas use one 100 times. The weight was familiar, but the act itself was foreign. A figure moved through the trees. She exhaled and pulled the trigger. The kick nearly sent her backward, but the shot found its mark. The man dropped, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Then silence. The scent of gunpowder lingered in the air, mixing with the damp earth and blood. The wind carried the last dying echoes of battle through the trees. Eleanor turned, scanning the darkness. Kane was still out there. A twig snapped. She spun just as he stepped into the clearing. Unlike his men, Kane showed no fear. His expression was one of cold amusement, his revolver resting easily in his grip. "Didn't think you had it in you," he mused, voice smooth as oil. Eleanor said nothing. He took another step forward, gaze flicking to Chayton, who remained silent beside her. Kane smirked. "So that's how it is? You think he's going to save you?" Eleanor tightened her grip on the rifle. "I don't need saving." Kane chuckled. "That's so." Then he moved, fast, too fast. His gun raised. The shot rang out before Eleanor could think. Kane staggered, eyes wide with shock as blood bloomed across his chest. His fingers twitched around the trigger, but his body had already betrayed him. He collapsed to his knees, then fell forward, face first into the dirt. Eleanor exhaled, the weight of the moment crashing into her all at once. It was over. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees as if whispering the land's approval. The night had taken what it was owed. Chayton stepped forward, crouching beside Kane's lifeless body. He said nothing, only studied the fallen man, before rising to meet Eleanor's gaze. There was no triumph between them, no celebration, only the quiet understanding that survival had come at a cost. The sun began to rise, streaking the sky with shades of gold and crimson. The warmth touched Eleanor's face, chasing away the last remnants of the night's terror. She turned to Chayton. "What now?" she asked. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then finally, he gestured toward the horizon. Home was still far away. But she was no longer the woman who had been taken. She had faced the darkness and walked through it, and she would keep walking.